The class fell silent. Professor Foster tore up Thomas's test and threw the scraps on the floor. "These scribbles aren't even worth wasting paper on." At that moment, no one knew that this humiliated student would one day shake the entire world. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Let's start from the very beginning. Professor Harold Foster was a man who valued intelligence the way others valued jewels. In his eyes, science was the domain of the chosen few, and school was an arena where the weak should be crushed under the weight of their own mistakes. He taught physics at one of the most prestigious private schools in the country, where parents paid exorbitant amounts to give their children the best education possible. But his love for science did not extend to all students. In Foster's view, only those who grasped material instantly were worthy of his attention. The rest were just excess baggage. When Thomas Miller joined his class, the professor immediately knew. This boy wouldn't last a semester. Just an ordinary poor kid who had somehow ended up in elite company. Thomas didn't look like his classmates. While others attended lessons in expensive suits, he wore worn-out jeans and a sweater that had clearly seen more than a few seasons. His textbook was so old that its pages had yellowed, and instead of a sleek laptop, he carried a simple notebook with a tattered cover. From the very beginning, Foster decided this boy wasn't even worth his time. "Mr. Miller." The professor's voice was sickly sweet, but beneath it lay a hidden contempt. "Since you were listening so attentively to the lecture, perhaps you could explain to us how Maxwell's equation works." Thomas lifted his head. He didn't yet realize it was a trap. Foster crossed his arms, his lips curving into a thin smirk. "Oh, my apologies." His tone suddenly turned mocking. "You probably don't have internet access to Google it." Laughter filled the classroom. Someone snorted, another whispered to their neighbor, "What a loser." Thomas felt something tighten inside him. He wasn't stupid. He knew the answer, but the words got stuck in his throat. It seemed that if he said anything now, he would only make things worse. "Well, it looks like we don't have a great physicist here, just a mere dreamer," Foster concluded coldly, turning back to the board. From that moment on, he never missed a chance to prove to the entire class that Thomas Miller didn't belong there. Every word, every glance, every biting remark was aimed at one thing, making sure this boy understood he was nothing. After every lesson with Foster, the class split into groups. Some eagerly discussed new topics, some exchanged jokes, and some simply laughed at Thomas. The students were divided into two camps. Some openly mocked him. They enjoyed watching the professor effortlessly destroy the poor student with a single biting remark. To them, it was a show, predictable and free of consequences. Others felt sorry for him. They were ashamed of Foster's behavior, but no one dared to challenge the respected professor. They simply watched in silence as Thomas clenched his fists, his face turning to stone, his posture hunched over his desk as if trying to disappear. But Thomas never complained. Instead, he stayed in the library late into the night. When the school was empty and the only sounds in the hallways were the echoes of the janitor's footsteps, he sat at a wooden table, bent over his textbooks. Sometimes his eyes would close from exhaustion, but he would shake his head, take a deep breath, and dive back into his work. He studied. He memorized. He searched for answers. One day he was caught by Sarah, one of the few who truly sympathized with him. She approached him in the hallway as he packed a stack of scribbled notes into his backpack. "Why don't you just leave?" she asked, looking at him with concern. "He humiliates you every day. Why put up with it?" Thomas looked at her and smiled. It was a tired smile, but there was not a trace of self-pity in it. "I can't leave," he answered quietly. "I want to prove that poverty is not a life sentence." But the pressure kept growing. Foster reveled in his role as judge and executioner. He nitpicked Thomas at every turn. Every answer in class was met with sarcasm. Every attempt to prove himself led to yet another public humiliation. And then, one day, something happened that no one expected. Foster took Thomas's test, scanned it briefly, and tore it in half in front of the entire class. "These scribbles aren't even worth wasting paper on." His voice was as cold as a verdict. "Miller, you won't make it in this subject. You have no place in science." Silence filled the room. Even those who usually laughed could feel that a line had been crossed. Thomas sat motionless, his fingers curling into fists under the desk. This was the last straw. He felt something tighten in his chest, the bitterness of frustration rising in his throat. All those nights in the library, all his efforts, all his dreams, did they mean nothing? Could one person really erase them with a single motion of his hand? That evening, he seriously thought about leaving. But when he found himself back in the library, when he looked at the pages filled with formulas, when he remembered all the moments when he had believed in himself despite everything, he realized he hadn't come this far just to give up. He would fight. Years passed. Harold Foster no longer remembered Thomas Miller. To him, he was just another student who had failed to meet expectations. There had been many like him in Foster's career, weak, incapable, irrelevant. They came, endured humiliation, broke down, left, disappeared. Their memories faded as quickly as chalk marks on a blackboard after a lecture. Thomas Miller, the poor boy in worn-out clothes, was nothing more than another fleeting episode in Foster's mind. He had erased him long ago. But one day, everything changed. One morning, as usual, Foster was sipping his coffee while scrolling through a scientific news portal. His eyes skimmed over the headlines, until one made him drop his cup. "American physicist Thomas Miller wins the Nobel Prize for a groundbreaking discovery in quantum mechanics." Foster reread the headline. Then again, his fingers trembled. It couldn't be. But it was true. The same Miller, the same boy he had mocked, the one he had humiliated in front of the entire class, the one whose tests he had torn to shreds. And now, that name echoed around the world. A chill ran down Foster's spine. He clicked on the article and scanned through the text. Thomas was barely in his 30s, and he had already made history. His discovery was rewriting the laws of physics. Journalists called him a genius, the new Einstein, the man who had changed the future of science. Foster was in shock. How? How had he achieved this? A few weeks later, the school where Thomas had once studied hosted a grand ceremony in his honor. Miller himself had agreed to speak to the students. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, even alumni from decades past had gathered to witness the legend. Foster sat in the front row. He didn't know how to feel. Pride? But he had done nothing to nurture this genius. Relief? But he had given him nothing but humiliation, anxiety, perhaps, because Thomas remembered him, and he knew what he had to say. The hall erupted in applause as Miller stepped onto the stage. He looked nothing like the boy Foster remembered, confident, strong, commanding. His voice carried no hesitation as he shared his story. He spoke of hardships, obstacles, struggles. But never once did he mention Foster. Yet everyone in the room knew. When the lecture ended, students lined up to shake Thomas's hand. Foster hesitated for a long time. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. But finally, he gathered the courage to step forward. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Foster swallowed hard. His voice wavered as he muttered, "I may have been too harsh on you." Thomas looked at him. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, only calmness. He smiled and replied evenly, "You weren't harsh, Professor. You were my greatest motivator." And with that, he turned away to shake the next student's hand. Foster stood frozen. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had lost. Foster rose from his seat but didn't rush to leave. He stood in the aisle, as if some part of him still hoped Thomas would say something in his defense. Just one word. Even a hint. But Thomas didn't even look in his direction. He stood before the audience, surrounded by students, professors, and journalists, all inspired by his story. Every single person gazed at him with admiration. They saw a genius, a man who had changed the world. Foster, on the other hand, felt empty. He stepped out of the hall, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor. His head was lowered. He had always believed he understood how the world worked, that he could distinguish those who would succeed from those who would fail, that his methods of humiliation, pressure, and strict discipline helped weed out the weak. But he had been wrong. He had lost. Thomas Miller hadn't broken. He hadn't walked away. He hadn't forgotten. He had turned every insult, every ounce of anger, every wound, into fuel for his dream. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was electric. Everyone wanted a photo with Thomas, to shake his hand, to ask him questions. Some scribbled excited notes, others recorded videos, and some simply stood in awe, unable to believe they were next to a man whose name was now known throughout the scientific world. But Thomas didn't feel like a star. He didn't feel like someone who had done the impossible. He felt at peace. This wasn't just about winning an award. It wasn't just about proving his worth. It was about showing the world, and, most importantly, himself, that success doesn't belong to those with wealth, connections, or privilege. Success belongs to those who refuse to give up. He remembered everything. The first mocking remark, the first test torn to shreds, the first time he had wanted to walk away but chose to stay. It had all led him here. He looked out at the sea of students before him, and in his mind he heard the words he wanted to share with anyone who had ever doubted themselves, who had ever felt that their fate was decided by others. A true genius is the one who refuses to give up, no matter what. And he smiled, because now it wasn't just his truth. Now the whole world knew it too. The whole